Yeah, don't let tech prevent you from doing what you want because the tech doesn't make your podcast or product go. It's what you do with the product that makes it go.
Welcome to the Everyday Talent Podcast. This is the go-to podcast for creators who are looking to carve out their unique path so that they can make their art and make happier money. I'm your host, Betty. I'm a career coach for creators and a fellow creative as well. On today's podcast, we are going to talk all about podcasting and the motivation to continue your creative passion even when it's not your full-time job. On today's podcast, I brought a fellow podcaster who is the host of the podcast, What Kind of Asian Are You? Kyle Leung. Kyle started the podcast as a side project while running a busy life. He's a dad of two. He has a full-time corporate job and now lives in Singapore with his family. So how did Kyle start his podcasting journey? What motivated him to start this podcast that tells the stories of Asian diaspora, and what's next for him in his journey? Without further ado, here's the interview with Kyle. Welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Talent Podcast. So on this podcast, we've interviewed a lot of artists, creators, but it's not often that we get to interview another fellow podcaster. So I'm very, very excited today that we have Kyle Leung here. Hi, Kyle.
Hi, Betty. How are you doing today?
Very well. Can you share a bit with the audience what you do and how do you come to do what you do?
For sure. So, first off, my name is Kyle. Again, very grateful and happy to be on the show. And a little bit about myself. I'm a Hong Kong Chinese Canadian that grew up in Canada, specifically in the East Coast, Ontario, Markham, all that fun stuff. I consider myself a third culture kid. My identity is very based on the fact that I'm part of the Asian diaspora. I'm very passionate about that, especially kind of the migration history and also kind of culture, identity, all that stuff in terms of how we interact with ourselves, with the world, and also our own kind of cultural makeup depending on where we're from. And I live a pretty normal life, a 9 to 5 job. However, I do live in Singapore at this time, and this is where I call home base now. And I don't do anything creative as a job per se, but I have now became someone who has a hobby of creating content online, specifically in the podcasting space. So I have a podcast called What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. So this is where I interview creatives, artists, musicians, business people, anyone from the Asian diaspora that want to share their story and stories that I think will help inspire and motivate the next generation of Asian diaspora growing up. That's me in a nutshell. Any further questions? I'm happy to answer them.
Awesome. One of the things that really struck me, so maybe I can give a little context to the audience. We met because online, we kind of found each other online. And I remember and always grateful that at the time it was like really early on in my coaching journey. I didn't have a podcast back then. And you sort of like connected with me and asked for an interview. And that really struck me in terms of your approach as a podcaster, but also a curator of content. So let's take a step back and think about the day or maybe like the time that you were thinking and envisioning what kind of Asians are you. And I want you to share a little bit with the audience. What was that moment that inspired you to create this podcast? And then what happened afterward in terms of like from idea to putting it at work and turning the concept to reality?
I think that's a great question, and I think that I don't really think too much about it day to day wise. But now that you asked, I think this is a great question for me to reflect on the journey. And this journey started, close to 4 years ago. I've always been a podcaster, or I mean, a podcast listener fan. I listen to a lot of different kind of podcasts, and I think that's kind of the reason why I kind of gravitate towards this platform per se. Of course, I was also watching a lot of YouTube related matters and stuff, but this was easier in terms of the barriers to entry is a little lower because your skill set and level doesn't have to be as high as say producing a video and putting it online. So that's why I picked podcasting to start at perhaps. But I think the moment that made me want to embark on this journey, this kind of hobby, was the fact that I had friends, close friends of mine, that had their own podcast that were doing it just for fun. We would just be on that podcast and talk about regular things that we care about, but not necessarily like matters to the world. But at least they put it out there, and that kind of planted the seed of like I could do that too because I seen my friends do it, seen what kind of work they put into it, and how I feel I could, you know, go into that and put my own twist on it and even do better than them. That was kind of the kind of initial spark. But on the flip side, I think the main reason why I started is because I felt a need to kind of be the person. I don't want to say that I'm a really great person or anything, but I feel like I have a like kind of mission to help other, specifically the Asian diaspora, share their stories because I find that in mainstream media, there's not enough of the Asian diaspora story, at least in the way that I feel like it relates to me specifically, because I always find that it's always about where, oh, I live in the West, I'm an Asian diaspora, I'm the only Asian diaspora there, and that's the only story that will be told. Like, oh, the smelly lunchbox, the people making fun of my parents' accent, I worked in the Asian restaurant. Those are all the only ones, but I did not have that experience. I grew up in Markham, where everyone, for most part, were Asian. So I don't have those similar experiences, but that's the only thing I could see in mainstream Western media that just like my lived experience as an Asian diaspora, which I understand, but I can't exactly relate. So I want to be that person in the podcast space for Asian diaspora, for those that may not have the exact same story as all of our Asian diaspora peers, but at least they could have their story told in the platform so that people can be aware of it.
Amazing. I noticed your energy and how passionate you are just now when you're talking about the mission. And I resonate really hard on a personal level because when I immigrated, I went to Richmond, BC, which, as you probably know, is very much kind of like Markham, full of it. Like, I didn't have the experience of being the only Asian. And in fact, I feel like because of that, we also understand that there's a lot of nuance within the Asian community and their storytelling. Which brings me to the next question. Is that over the last 4 years, you've interviewed many, many different Asians practicing different profession, but also we've witnessed that the storytelling landscape for Asians and by Asians have evolved a lot in the last 4 years. So I'm curious what have been some of your biggest learning and what are your observations in terms of how has this landscape of like Asian storytelling shifted?
I think the biggest thing I've noticed from doing this podcast since 2020 has been the fact that the barrier to platform your own stories, the ability to share your stories, and the ability to get really successful from it has kind of really, no, it's limitless. There's no limits to it essentially because people have a thirst for these kind of stories. They want to see people that they could relate to. And even if you're not from the Asian diaspora, you're curious about what that could be. So there's another point in terms of you as Asian diaspora sharing the stories for other people outside of your community to know who you are, what you're about, and how you are as a person. So that no, they could be able to kind of translate these kind of experiences to those that no cannot relate on the deeper level, but at least they're aware. So then more understanding with people, better empathy, and all that stuff. So I think the landscape changed in terms of like it's a lot easier for Asian diasporas to share their stories compared to before. I think much of Asian diaspora for the longest time has always been just hoping that mainstream media gives them a chance, give them a shot, let them, be the main character or anything like that. But we are now in the age where with social media, with TikTok, with Instagram, and all that stuff, with YouTube, you're kind of in your control. You could be your own creator, be your own channel, be your own like platform to share the stories that you want to tell. So then you have more kind of how to put it, more ownership of your own story, so that it could be the most authentic story of yourself rather than watered down if it's in mainstream media, because it will be watered down so that it could be relatable to also someone from the Midwest that's not Asian.
In some in some way, I'm hearing that parallel between how Asian storytelling is becoming more nuanced and complex, and your wish to start this podcast is to showcase exactly that. I want to turn the focus a bit to your own process of creating this podcast. We are both self-taught podcaster here, so I'm dying to know what have been some of your biggest challenge in terms of learning how to make a podcast, continuously improving on it, and I'm continuously being motivated to continue it.
I think for me, the biggest hurdles or struggle with creating, with continuing on this kind of hobby, this journey, has been the fact that I am aware of how things got to work in terms of making it successful, in terms of like, oh, I know there's a blueprint, there's formulas and all that stuff I could follow so that the podcast could be successful, and I want to gravitate towards doing that. But that will make me to have to be more strict on myself in terms of creating, in terms of following what I think will succeed, make this podcast popular or whatever. But I feel like it's a hard because you got to set the foundation first before you can move on to the next thing. But for me, if I started the podcast already, I can't just stop everything and be like, let's start from the beginning again and build everything from ground up. Because I have kind of set up the podcast in a way where I'm learning as I go, so that I can't really kind of have a strong foundation of like, this is how I'll do things all the time, because I'm trying to work things out to see what's works best for me. So I guess now my biggest problem has been where I am aware that, oh, there should be easier way to make things more efficient, but then when it comes time to doing it, I'm often the worst person to follow through and execute how I want, because I know I need to deliver something still. I'm not saying that I'm delivering crap at the end of the day, but at the same time, I'm not delivering it the way that I want to deliver to make it more efficient for me and easy for me. Because I do have a framework that I want to follow, but I haven't really structured it down where I roll everything into like each points and stuff, and then I can follow it. If you catch my drift in terms of a system, like I'm aware there's a system to make everything easier and easier for you to be popular, but I need to start from basics first, and I don't have time to go back to do that in a sense without like stopping everything and just maybe I should do that so it'd be easier on me, moving forward. But I just want to create and learn as I go, and if it takes longer, then so be it.
I think you just hit on a note that a lot of not just podcaster, but a lot of creative people kind of face. I wouldn't say struggle with. There's a tension between like you know that there's a framework or process that will probably make things more systemized or efficient and quote unquote more perfect. But then there's also wanting to create and put it out there. And there's no perfect answer in terms of like which one at what ratio. Like it really depends on the project and the person.
And I think I get away with this just because I'm doing everything on my own. Like if I have someone to work with, then of course that framework, that system, if everything is in place, it's a lot easier for everyone. But because I'm doing it on my own, I could be like, oh, I'm not gonna follow it, but I could still get it work done because everything is up for me to decide. But if say there's another person, I can be like, oh, I want to do it this way, this episode, but next episode I'm gonna do it some other way, just because it's more convenient for me at that time. So I guess that's the benefit of working on my own. But at the same time, if I work with someone else, then it'll be a lot easier as well because more people to help.
if you work with someone else, I think it forces you to like articulate what the framework is. I totally resonate with that. But then when you're working on your own, there's also the beauty of flexibility. I can just do it this way for this episode. Yeah. My next question is revolving around definition of success when the project is not necessarily related to a monetary gain. It's not your full-time job. And I should say this is probably of interest of many people who listen to this podcast because I think that the hardest, like I always say, the first thing that is easiest to go is your passion project. If you have a busy life, which you do, you have a job, you have a family. So I'm curious, how do you define success for yourself in terms of relationship to this podcast? And how do you remind yourself and ground yourself with that purpose?
The way I've been kind of looking at this in terms of the podcast and then what is success for the podcast if certain goals are met. First off, I think I have very early on defined what are the goals for the podcast, which I mentioned earlier is really to provide a platform for other Asian diasporas to share their stories. And at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing for me that dictate whether I find this podcast successful is eventually if I can monetize it. And eventually, I think the biggest goal is, I could just quit everything and just do this podcast as a career. I'm nowhere close to doing that, and I don't think I ever will, but it would be nice if that's kind of the North Star. But that's not the most important thing. I think as I got along through doing this, learning more about how to do podcasting, also the industry as well, and hearing from other people doing it. The important thing for me to keep doing this in terms of determine what is success for this podcast is just hearing feedback from people that listen to it or are aware of what this podcast is and what kind of energy they give me back. If the energy is good, and if say like for example, I think you kind of provided me with some sort of kind of feedback in a prior conversation. Well, the fact that you're doing what you're doing is still going on, that really inspires me to keep going with mine and such. I think that really is something that I consider as a success for me in terms of podcasting because I think these kind of feedback drives me and dictates or kind of determine for me what I did is successful. If people give me good feedback, I think that really helps. The other thing is getting the recognition or just having people connect with me that are also doing similar things or like they're in the Asian diaspora doing things that I really appreciate. If they are like relating to me or like find what I'm doing of value and that they support what I'm doing as well, then I think that's a success as well. And I think the last thing that would make me feel like this podcast is successful if is I'm having fun still and that I'm learning every day. I think those are the key points.
Yeah, this is also very clear. Like there's there can be a bigger North Star, and then at the same time, in the moment, you still need to like kind of be honest with yourself and see, hey, am I still having fun? And also that feedback that you mentioned in terms of the community of people. One thing that I always notice and admire about you is that even though you sometimes interview a guest and feels like that episode, that's it, that relationship ends there. But I think for you keep track of like all the folks in the Asian community and the guests.
I try
and you
to. I
keep,
try
keep
to.
in touch. Yeah.
I try to.
Which is really difficult to do. I'm just saying, I don't
Yeah.
know. This is why you and I have kept kept in touch over the years, and it's because I always feel like you are like a champion. You're supporting what I'm doing, and many others. Yeah.
Just think that it's just part of me wanting to see more Asian diaspora creators doing great things. So that's why I keep on doing what I do in terms of following up, supporting, and such. Even if I don't have this podcast, I think I'll do the same. It's just in a different capacity. But given that I still have this podcast, I might as well use this platform I have as spotlight and build connections because who knows, maybe they could help me reach my goals closer or sooner. But the end goal for me is just to have fun and keep learning and build a community and hopefully I could make a career out of it. But it's not main priority because I don't know if this kind of career is for me at the end of the day. But we'll see.
One thing that you just recently touched on, I listened to your podcast with Cheryl Lau, who has also been on this podcast before, and I've gone to Cheryl's podcast, that really hit a chord with me was that this balance or tension between putting yourself out there and wanting to keep a private life and drawing some boundary. And I want to bring that up in our conversation because that often also comes up with my work with my clients, which is they understand the need of like, in order to amplify their work and their voices, they want to be out there or need to feel the need to be out there. However, they are not really into this whole thing of like putting their all of their life or everything about them on the internet. What's your take on that, and how do you balance that?
That's a really good question, and like you mentioned, I kind of touched on that topic in a different podcast. And I still stand with what I said, whereas you just have to find the kind of the boundaries and also recognize what you're comfortable with doing versus what you're not comfortable with doing. You share what you want, and the line you just have to figure out on your own. No one can tell you what it could be. But upon further reflection, I think for myself at least, the reason why I need to draw these boundaries or that I'm more comfortable kind of not sharing as much as I could so that I could build this brand and such, it's just because of my own internal kind of struggle with how I feel as a person. Maybe I'm just not confident enough that people would really resonate with what I put out that was really personal to me. So it's the fear of that. Oh, not getting the response I want. But then I think it's something that would and should work on eventually if I really want to be a better kind of person in front of the camera or with the mic and such, and also as a person as a whole in terms of being able to share more comfortably and be more authentic and not hide behind like not saying stuff. Because I think that's kind of after more reflection on that question specifically, I'm just scared. It's hard being vulnerable on social media or in public as a whole. So working on that is gonna be what I want to prioritize, and uh, everything else should work its way. No, like it will work its way out. So as long as I be more confident in that what I have, what I want to share, if I do intend to share, will resonate with people, or even if they don't, at least I put it out there. If it's successful, then it's great. If it's not, then it's just a piece of content. It's out there, it lives on, but people don't really remember the things that they don't care for.
Thank you for being honest in terms of like your feeling or insecurity related to like putting yourself out there opinion. It does make me, because we are two fellow podcasters here, like this kind of make me think sometimes I also feel that like being a podcast host, especially on the interview podcast format, I can hide a little bit behind the format itself. And I'm hoping that the questions itself convey like my perspective, but it's also very comforting to hide behind that, like be the behind the scene person. So I resonate with that on that note. Yeah. A lot of folks want to and continue want to starting podcasts nowadays, and there's a lot of podcasts out there. I I feel like you and I have chatted like on social media before. Like sometimes I have like existential crisis about like what is this podcast? What's my podcast role? You know, going forward, and why does it need to exist? So I'm curious on a philosophical level. Have you thought about, is there a right reason, a wrong reason to start a podcast? And also for folks who might want to start a podcast, what should they be mindful of?
I think there's no kind of wrong reasons to start because I think if you have all the good intentions, then more reason for you to start it. But if you have bad intentions, eventually using a very business term, but the market will solve will solve you
Readjust
essentially.
itself.
Huh?
Yeah. The
the
market
market
will
will
readjust
decide.
and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So if it's for bad intention, eventually you'll get flushed out, or you will move on to something else. Because if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, then it means that you don't really like it as much, and then you lose passion, and then you just move to the next thing you want to do. So if you really want to do it, just do it. Because at the end of the day, if you're not good at it or you don't catch on, then no one hears it. It's no big deal. And as much as people say whatever's on the internet lives forever, true, but you also got the ownership and the ability to just remove it and take it down as much as you want. And I assume that at the end of the day, you only putting out what you're comfortable with, unless you're reckless. But at the same time, you put out what you put out, so you can't regret or anything like that. You just need to have a good filter or editorial kind of mindset. And then the second part is what advice I give to people wanting to start. Just start it because there's so many already. So it's either that you get really good at it and then you become the one that stands out, or you'll just fade to black in a sense where you're just one amongst so many that people are not gonna catch on, and then no harm. Not unless you really want to make it, then you'll just have to work harder to figure out how to stand out and all that stuff.
I think my main takeaway from this conversation with you is that in terms of like all the thought that we go into when we're putting out a podcast out there, whether it's a podcast or something new, is that we sometimes do the overthinking of like, is it good enough? Is it relevant? Do I have the process down? But ultimately, we actually grow as content creator as we put something out there. The moment that we make it real in the world and continue to put out more content, we actually learn from that process.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add on one more thing is like, just think of your podcast as not as a kind of content or kind of art or any kind of media where you're really reliant on a successful one season, like Netflix, where they would just cancel you if you cannot get the ratings or whatever. Your podcast, if you keep doing it, if you hit goal with one particular episode, say it goes viral, then if you have to keep doing it, then you have a lot of other episodes for them to also listen to and the backlog, and then you keep continue the kind of the wave. It's not like you have I have to be able to be successful by the 10th episode, then I could keep doing it. You could keep doing it as long as you want, especially if you start off as like a podcast as a hobby. Then you could do it as long as you want until you be like, the amount of effort and the money or whatever, is it worth my time? I'd rather do something else instead. Then yeah, then you will stop. But say if it's not like a business or anything, you have no kind of uh, need to kind of do anything to kind of for those stakeholders that could be involved. You're not running a business where you need to profit right away, so it could be a slow burn. Like I feel like I still haven't hit what I want to hit yet, and I'm already 4 years in, almost 100 episodes. So you just gotta keep doing it. I think at the end of the day, the way I mentioned to someone is that with podcasting, you win when you're the last podcast standing. So just wait for every other podcast to fade to black, and if you're still around, then you win. Because I guarantee you that so many podcasts are gonna fade to black before you, if you just keep going at it. I mean, so many podcasts during the pandemic years already falter before 2021. So if you're able to last more than a year, or even less than that, you already succeeded compared to a lot of other podcasts.
I love everything you share there. The way that I've learned as well is that like you're kind of the podcast has like this beautiful to that particular format has a beautiful way of forming itself as like almost like educational content, a reservoir of content. I noticed that especially because I took a summer break, 1.5 months summer break from the podcast, and I noticed like because I get this report from week to week that sometimes from a certain week I just suddenly got so many views, and I realized it's because someone went back like the whole library and listened to every episode, and I was like, how did that happen? Surely I've done that as a podcast lover when I found a really good podcast, and really that's all the more reason, like you said, like don't benchmark yourself as in like if by episode 10 I don't hit this goal, I will stop. It's really a marathon rather than a sprint.
Can I actually ask you a quick question, or it could be a long
Yeah, go
answer if you
ahead.
want.
Yeah.
You mentioned views. I was thinking for yourself, how much do you look at views or like listens or those metrics when you're kind of look at the grand scheme of things? Because obviously, based on how me and you are doing it for podcast wise, we do care about how the trends are and the listens and the views and such. So for you, how do you look at those numbers kind of thing? Because before I always be like, I don't want to focus on it, but now I've got it. I don't want to say I'm big, but I got it to a point where I do have people reaching out to me asking to be on the show, and also like I do get some opportunities here and there to do more podcast related matters. So numbers do matter. So how do you look at that, and does it matter for you that much?
So thank you for that question. I feel like year one, when I was like starting the podcast, I also had that hope of like it will be an incremental or like maybe exponential increase. So I look at the numbers, especially listenership, a lot. Then my like that didn't happen, first of all, and what instead happened was that like kind of similar to your metric of success, I heard lots of like good feedback. And also, in some cases, I've heard people who are on the podcast got connected with like a client or a new job opportunity because of my podcast. So I was like, oh, that's a better metric of looking at it. But it's still hard not to looking at the views. It would be complete lie for me to say that I don't care about that. But more and more, I guess I know I'm actually more drawn to when there is a more of a sudden spike. What is the reason behind it? Rather than like, oh, did I increase like 10% of my viewer, like followers last month? I find that that doesn't really mean a lot.
I think I'm on the same kind of process, kind of numbers, metric, and stuff. But I'm also, I guess, maybe it's not a fault, but I do find it very like I'm guilty of like understanding the numbers game and also that, but like also wanting to be part of that system, even though I know it's not good. So I'm always kind of battling like, oh, I know that if I want to get to the next level, I need to hit those numbers or whatever it may be. Like for example, like no, I've been very not focused, but like cognizant of like Instagram following and all that stuff. Where like for the longest time, I've been like, oh, let me get to 1,000, let me get to 1,000, because things will happen at 1,000. But I've hit 1,000 now, and nothing really changes. And I find that it doesn't really make listenership go higher or lower, or that I get more views on like my social media. It's just a number. It's nice to have that kind of number, but though honestly, even if I don't have that many followers on Instagram, doesn't mean I don't have listenerships. That's what I figured. And your biggest supporter might not show up numbers wise at the end of the day.
That's such a good insight because we like that's the double-edged sword of a number, right? Because like you sort of want some goal. It's the easiest way to go there, but then you realize once you cross the threshold, it doesn't really mean anything. I also think that us having this conversation draws an important distinction for the audience who want to start a podcast. That like your podcast is a podcast that like is measured by the success of like podcast growing, whereas my podcast is kind of like a subproduct of like my business because it's related to coaching and people in the art sector, which is like what like the service that I offer through my business. So those goals might be also a little bit different in relation to a podcast that's for podcast sake, and then a podcast that's related to a business or affiliated with one. I had a friend a couple of weeks ago ask me this, and I feel like we just kind of makes an assumption that people know this. So I'm going to ask you, because essentially, what are the tools? Like, let's get to the nitty gritty. If someone was to start a podcast, what technology? How much do they expect to invest in it? What's the minimum viable like starter kit for a podcast?
Use your phone, upload directly from Spotify, and open up an Instagram page. I think that's
Wow, that is actually very minimal. That's like more minimal than what I said.
I think that at the end of the day, uh, you putting it out there is more important than what tools you use or what things you buy so that you can support what you want to do. Like those things that you can buy and pay for can come later on after you gotta commit to it long enough. Because you might decide that after two episodes that, oh, this is not for me, and you could quit. But if you're buying it right away, then you're kind of stuck to be like, I want to make my money's worth. I need to at least record 10 episodes first. But then what's the point? So only buy it if you're really interested in that kind of tool or whatever it may be. Because then you also come back to the question that, why, if you want to do it like that, then why don't you just hire people to do it for you? Too, right? Rather than do everything on your own, which I think a lot of people assume, oh, I will do that first. But if you're gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna buy a really expensive microphone, use the most whatever tools, that just have someone edit your podcast, produce your podcast, and package it and do the whole thing. You can start paying from that and make it a really professional podcast. But is that what you need? I don't know.
I love that. Like it can really be really simple. And I I would just jump in and share my experience. I use a podcast hosting platform called Buzzsprout. But initially I got the most basic plan, the cheapest plan on a monthly basis. Because just in case, like you said, what if I don't do it after 3 episodes? So there's and then I edited everything when I was like starting out. So definitely like use the resource that you have and don't think too much about the technology and all this like expensive microphone or whatever that you need. You can literally use your current headphone. I think that's how I started.
Yeah, don't let tech prevent you from doing what you want, because the tech doesn't make your podcast or product go. It's what you do with the product that makes it go.
That's going to be a soundbite in the social media, you know that. Yeah, that was really good. So what's next for you? And what's next for what kind of Asian are you?
It's tough because it's always a matter of whether I can execute what I have in my mind or push myself enough to be able to just produce, release. No, always create is kind of the main thing with the kind of creator economy is like just always create and create, and then you'll be successful. So I want to move towards that, but there are my limitations with like my work and my family and all that stuff. But in the ideal situation, I want to keep growing this podcast. I see a lot of potential in it because of the fact that I've been doing it for the past 4 years. I've been grinding it out. I'm at a stage where I feel like I have not necessarily a name for myself or the podcast have become something where, but at least people are actually still coming up and be like, oh, I want to be on the podcast, or like have people have their PR people ask me, oh, can they come on the podcast and stuff. So I feel like I do have some legitimacy in the aspect. So that's also another thing that keeps me thinking that, oh, this is worth going to keep going. Uh, but in terms of moving the needle forward for the podcast, I think it's just keep doing what I'm doing, get better at all the stuff that are important to make a good podcast. So improve my kind of overall tech skills and also, but interview skills as well, and kind of coordinating podcasting as a whole and producing and all that stuff. But I think I also want to be more creative in the aspect of creating more, not necessarily lifestyle content, but just more content about myself in terms of letting people know more about me. And I'm trying to figure out how to kind of do that within my own podcast page, because I don't want to start a brand new page and do it from there, because I already established kind of an audience and community already here that I want to kind of use this, and hopefully people are interested in it. Where I think I will embark on kind of like a challenge where like I need to create like a reel every day for X amount of days. And will revolve around me kind of building this podcast in public. I don't know if you're familiar with those kind of build in public kind of content where people are building whatever they're building and sharing it with the world as they're doing it. I kind of want to do it for my podcast, but I need to just more be more
Oh.
strategic about it in terms of because a lot of the podcast stuff is you're not really doing things that are like active or like moving, so it's kind of hard to film it and produce it. But I'm trying to figure out a way. But also intend to create other content as well that revolve around
Yeah.
either myself, the creative journey, or things related to the Asian diaspora. That's for the podcast. But long term wise, I want to build up another project, which I think if I could get it to work, would be really fun and exciting for me, just because it's really another passion of mine. Uh, I guess I can review it now. I haven't really started
Yeah.
yet, but I essentially want to first start off with like an Instagram page where it's essentially I want to build a community or kind of a support kind of way of for those that are interested in Cantonese and Cantonese culture, if they're in the diaspora where Cantonese is not their strongest language and stuff, they can't read or write or speak that well. I can provide them with content and resources available that they could take on that could either connect them with their culture more or teach them Cantonese and all that stuff and introduce them to Cantonese culture, but not in a way where it's hard for them to understand. So it's very much like Cantonese culture for those in the diaspora that English is their main language kind of thing. But I'm not sure how I'm gonna run that yet. It could be like, oh, here's the five Cantonese type things, like those lexicals and all that stuff. That's the start, but the idea isn't really fleshed out yet. But I already have like a page set up on Instagram. It's private, but nothing is there yet. But I'm trying to figure out how to do it.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that. I mean, I personally would love that as a Cantonese person, and also sharing with my friends. And lots of like my friends are raising children that like we talk about a lot about how is the next generation going to like learn Cantonese and things like that. So, and I also love your spirit of like as you continue the podcast, you're also thinking about innovating and diversifying the content. So that's very exciting. So for the last question, I would ask you to not just share with the audience where it can find you and the podcast, but also since you mentioned that people be reaching out to you to pitch to you to come on the podcast, maybe you can share a little bit if folks were to reach out to you to want to come on the podcast, what kind of criteria and what would be a good fit for coming for you to consider a guest on the podcast?
Again, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast talking to you and learning from you. And for those that are interested in learning more about myself or the podcast or get involved in this community that I have going, you can always just look us up on What Kind of Asian Are You podcast on like online through either Instagram. The Instagram handle is What Kind of Asian Pod, and then on all streaming platforms, if you search What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, you should be able to see us. You can always follow us there, leave reviews if you have listened to it, ratings and all that stuff. The normal things that podcasters tell you to do, you can consider doing that for me if you find us of value. The second part of the question is what kind of criteria I have in terms of taking in on guests for the podcast?
Yes.
I think it must be where you want to share your story, because if it's where you don't feel comfortable with sharing, then what's the point of coming on the podcast in the first place? So you have a story to tell, you have something that you want to share. You're part of the Asian diaspora. You are doing something really cool and interesting with your life. It doesn't have to be cultural related, but I would really appreciate if it's something where it connects back to your culture, because I really enjoy hearing stories of those people that are from the Asian diaspora that are either doing something for their work or for a hobby that reconnects them back to their culture, because I think that's important and it helps inspire and motivate others to do the same as well if they hear their stories. So those are the kind of criteria. But I guess though it's always good to just reach out to me and pitch yourself, and if I find it of interest, then I'll say let's do it. Usually I will say yes, but you never know. If it's not the right fit, then I'm not going to do it, or I would just refer you to someone else that could be a better fit for you.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll be sure to include all the include links in the show note to access your awesome podcast. Thank you so much for coming on the Everyday Talent podcast today, Kyle, and sharing your story and some of your exciting aspirations that we can expect to come.
Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode on the Everyday Talent podcast. This is the go-to podcast for the most candid takes on all things creative career related. If you like what you heard today, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and or whatever platform you listen to podcasts. I also encourage you to share this episode with a creative friend. That will go a long way in helping us to support more creatives and make them feel seen. And if you're looking for more content, subscribe to my e-newsletter, Passionate Enough, where I share insights on how we can give ourselves permission to set up a career so that we are just passionate enough in what we do, make our art, and work to live rather than live to work. And if you're looking for one-on-one support, I also have 2 one-on-one coaching programs dedicated to support creatives looking for mindful reinvention in their career and or go beyond aimless hustle in their freelancing. Check it out in the show notes and book a free consultation call today. May we build a creative career that nourishes our life and not sucking our soul. See you on the next episode.